Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking with me through that break. If you are just tuning in here on Sports by GSMC Podcast Network, in that first segment, we broke down why I thought the running back market seemingly did a 180 from last year, having to do with Christian McCaffrey and how impactful he was, and that showed the rest of the league that, as well as the talent in this year's draft, that's always going to be a part of it. But the running backs have been paid. Derrick Henry went to uh, Baltimore, and Saquon got paid to go to the Eagles. There's been a lot of movement around the league. So we are all for people getting paid here. In this segment coming up, we are going to break down one of the massive trades that happened yesterday, that being Brian Burns being traded to the New York Giants. What that means for the Panthers, what that means for the Giants as far as look ahead, not just at this season but seasons to come. What kind of message it sends from each of the front offices. But before we get too far into that, remember that if you would like to be an even bigger part of the show than you already are, all you need to do is go to gsmcpodcast.net. Again, that link is gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation. It'll pop up on the bottom of the screen there for you, me, everyone else to see across all platforms: YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, anywhere we are streaming live. We appreciate anything that you do give. And again, that link to tip or donate is gsmcpodcast.net. But like I was saying, we are going to get into one of the two massive trades that happened earlier yesterday. That being Brian Burns, star defensive end from the Carolina Panthers, being traded to the New York Giants. And what makes this move super interesting is that isn't it is the context that is around this. Starting off, the compensation for this trade was a second round pick and a fifth round pick to the Carolina Panthers. The Carolina Panthers, who obviously are not a very good team. They're a team that is in full rebuild mode. They went out and they put out a lot to go and get the quarterback that they thought would be the quarterback of their future in Bryce Young, and that obviously did not work. And there's a lot of factors. I'm not ready to cast Bryce Young off yet as a bust, but there's a lot of factors. He definitely had a part in it. The coaching staff had a major part in it as well. Apparently, news broke a couple days ago that they changed the entire playbook a week before the regular season started. So everything that he had done up to then was pointless. So it's not all his fault for the season that he had. But the Panthers were awful either way. No matter how you slice it, no matter who you give the blame to, the Panthers were not a very good team. So Brian Burns, one of the mainstays on that Panthers defense that, in all honesty, hasn't been that awful. Uh, Now, last year, again, everything was awful for them last year, so the defense was not very good. But Brian Burns has been a stud on that defense for quite some time. Such a stud that 2 years ago, when the Rams were trying to make a Super Bowl run, they offered the Panthers two firsts and a second for Brian Burns. The Panthers, who at the time were semi-competitive for a wild card spot, they were about 500. They turned it down. They said, no, Brian Burns is too important. He's going to be a mainstay on our defense for as long as he's here. He is a Panther. He is not going anywhere. And just 2 years later, here we are. Brian Burns has been franchise tagged twice. He almost sat out all of last season. He did threaten to do that and eventually came back and played that first game. Uh, he has been traded to the New York Giants, making that Giants defensive line, and I don't want to overreact here. I do have a little bias here as a Giants fan, but making the Giants defensive line one of the best in football. And I know that might sound crazy if you haven't looked at it, but Dexter Lawrence on the inside, he's a top five, probably top three defensive tackle in the entire league, only behind Chris Jones, Aaron Donald. He is one of the best. Then you have up and coming pass rusher in Kayvon Thibodeau, who is kind of underrated. He does play for the Giants. He's not the most complete package, but he's very good at getting pressure on the edge. And then you add Brian Burns, who at his peak was a top five pass rusher in the league. Now, last year, again, a lot of that had to do, it wasn't his greatest season, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that defenses could just kind of key in on him because the rest of the Panthers were not that big of threats. That defense took a big step back, but you could make the argument that Brian Burns is a top five pass rusher in the league, and for the Giants to get him for a second and a fifth really is huge. Now, the Giants aren't really a team that's competing this season. They have made a couple moves. They lost Saquon Barkley, obviously. That's the big move that's surrounding them. But bringing in a guy like Brian Burns to help shore up that defense is going to be really, really, really big. Again, those Giant Super Bowls of the early 2010s, late 2000s, they were built on the line. So they're building up that defensive line, and they're also building up that offensive line. They've made a couple really sneaky good signings on that offensive line. That's what they were focusing on. They got 3 or 4 starting offensive linemen. Excuse me. They got 3 or 4 starting offensive linemen, and they've really worked hard to build it up next to Andrew Thomas on the left side. Uh, it'll be interesting to see how they all gel together. The Giants are still trying to compete. They brought in Drew Lock as a backup to Daniel Jones for the season. Both guys who were drafted in the same draft. Both guys who I thought were very similar quarterbacks coming out of the draft. So it's interesting to see them on the same team now. But the Giants bringing in a backup is important. Obviously, Daniel Jones is not the answer, it seems. He does have one more year to prove it. So maybe he can get something done without Saquon. But he also has coming off a torn ACL, so he's not going to be able to start the season. It's going to be probably Drew Lock to start the season, hand the reins back over to Daniel Jones, and then anything could happen. The Giants and the Panthers aren't in the best spots as organizations. The Panthers are trying to go full rebuild mode, while the Giants are desperately trying to claw themselves out of a long rebuild that they have been in for quite some time, since about 2015. They've been rebuilding. So the Giants are ready to get out of that. They're trying to make these moves to win. The Panthers, on the other hand, are blowing it up. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with these two teams as we continue with the offseason. The other major trade that happened, Carlton Davis was traded for 2 seconds. Carlton Davis, the cornerback for the Buccaneers, he, during their Super Bowl runs, was a lockdown corner. And he's kind of taken a little bit of a step back. Corner is one of those positions that it's really, really, really tough to be elite at for your entire career. It's a super short window of you being a prime athlete just because of how demanding it is. Corner is probably the hardest position to play, not just in football, but in all of sports. Because you don't have any control of it. All you have to do, all you're doing is trying to stay with the most explosive athletes in the entire world at wide receiver. And also you have to tackle them, and you can't touch them at all. So it's really, really tough to play corner. I respect anyone that does it at a high level, and Carlton Davis is one of those guys. Carlton Davis has proven he is worth it, and he is going to get those 2 first round picks the Bucks are getting is not first, excuse me. Those 2 second round picks the Bucks are getting, absolutely a good trade. I like it for both sides. They weren't going to be able to keep him long term, freeing up cap space so they could pay for that Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans contract, as well as some other players that they still need to pay. Levante David, they did franchise tag Antoine Wells. The Bucks are are trying to figure out that cap situation right now. But the other part of that Brian Burns trade that I realized I didn't talk about is right after it was like a sign-in trade. Picks were traded. Giants gave Brian Burns a 5-year, $150 million contract, making him the second highest paid defensive end in the entire league. 87.5 of it is guaranteed. It's a lot of money. He's probably worth it. He is 26 at this point. This will carry him through his age 31 season, I believe. Uh, it's interesting. 150 is a lot for a guy that most people wouldn't classify as a top edge rusher. Now, I think he is one of them. He is up there. You see what he's been able to do on, quite honestly, awful roster. That is the Carolina Panthers. But giving him $150 million right off the bat, I don't know how good of an investment that is. It's a lot of money to give a guy like that. But to get that trade done, I think that was a almost necessity. Otherwise, giving up 2 picks for a guy that you're only going to have for one season isn't quite worth it, even if it is just a second and a fifth. Uh, Locking him up long term was something that the Giants had to do to even make that trade make any sense, and they were able to do that. So, as much as I do have some holds about how big that contract is, I don't really have that many complaints about it. I think it's a very good contract uh, for both sides. Obviously, $150 million for a player, we're all for that. We love players getting paid here on the show. This is my favorite week. Everyone's getting paid. Uh, but for the Giants, locking up a really, really solid guy long term is very important. Uh, but yeah, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this trade, the Carlton Davis trade, the Jerry Jeudy trade. I know we talked a little bit about that yesterday. This is uh, it's been there's been just a couple trades so far. Obviously, this has been more about free agents being signed and stuff. In our next segment coming up, we're actually going to talk about another trade. Justin Fields. I know we've talked about this to death, and a lot of you guys are going to be like, "Ugh, this again, Justin Fields." But no, there's been a couple new developments. Obviously, free agency has gone wild in its first 24, 48 hours of being open. But the there's running out of space for Justin Fields to go in. So we'll talk about that in our next segment. Comment from Crazy Dude. Giants division contenders. I do not think they're division contenders. They still have the Eagles and the Cowboys in that division, and their quarterback situation is a mess. They've just lost their best player on offense. I just think getting a guy like Brian Burns and locking him up is something that's huge for that team. Keeping that guy invested in your team, especially if you're going to give up 2 picks for assets, uh, it's it's not quite the it's not quite the move. But anyway, stick around. In our next break, in our next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about Justin Fields, the moves that have affected him and his trade stock, as well as in the segment after that, we're going to be covering just some breaking news. There's already been 3 or 4 free agent signings that have happened while we're talking, so we're going to go through all of those in our 4th segment, so we're not interrupting each segment as it goes in. But thank you everyone so much for tuning in so far to Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. We will be right back.